My name is Dan Cameron, and I'm Chief Curator here at the Orange County Museum of Art. I am presenting the exhibition, the Avant-Garde Collection, as an overview of about 100 objects spanning 1922, roughly, to about 2013. So it looks at the idea of the avant-garde as it appeared, was manifested at various points over the last roughly 100 years, beginning at a point when the idea of the avant-garde was almost a dominant, almost half ideological notion, to a period after the mid-century when you didn't really talk about the avant-garde anymore, you talked about an avant-garde. It became less of a dominant idea and more dispersed into particular communities and moments. So the exhibition looks really at some of the best works in our collection whose dates in which they were made means at that moment in time they were themselves part of the avant-garde in contemporary art. Most of the artists in the exhibition are California-based. So we move, for example, from a period in the 20s when you have an artist like Stanton McDonald Wright, who grew up in Los Angeles, lived in Paris, and then came back to California in 1919 and became a sort of an evangelist for the avant-garde, to artists working today in the community. For example, Alexa Smith, whose work is behind me, has been a very active and influential artist in the Los Angeles community for 4 decades. And so even though not everything in the exhibition is from California, kind of overwhelming majority of it is. And I feel that's in part because this museum, the program and the philosophy of the museum, has generally tended to be about supporting the avant-garde at the time that it's happening. Not that that's something that's so easy to locate or identify today, but it is something the museum has made a history of, and one of the reasons we have the collection that we're lucky enough to have is because the curators here really were very early on in supporting these artists who were a little bit ahead of their time. The reason this exhibition stands out for me is because it's the second in an extended effort on my part to really get comfortable with the more than 3,000 objects in the collection. And to do that, one needs to kind of sift through it using a number of different themes. The first exhibition was about the relationship between landscape and abstraction in California art, and now what I'm mostly focused on is this idea of how the new, or the cutting edge of contemporary art became such an important and central feature of how the museum identified itself. For me, that's particularly important because I'm familiarizing myself with an avant-garde that I wasn't really aware of. To take an example, Lynn Folks, who for many years was considered kind of underground, talked on a panel discussion at the museum not long ago about his teacher, a painter named Richard Rubin. And I was familiar enough with Richard Rubin to see a little bit of him in Pacific Standard Time and know that we had a couple of pieces. But it wasn't really until I started thinking about his relationship to the avant-garde of Los Angeles in the 50s that I also began to realize and understand that an artist of that degree of influence at his time could already have slipped between the cracks, so that most viewers wouldn't know his name. They wouldn't necessarily even have been able to pinpoint what it is that made him important or avant-garde at his time. And I continue it by putting Lynn Folks' earliest piece that we own, a painting from 1961 that most people would never identify as Lynn Folks, kind of right across the room from the Richard Rubin, so they can see each other again after all these years, after 50 or 60 years of being separated. The Edward Kienholz in the museum's collection is part of a body of work that he began shortly after he went to Berlin for the first time. He was fascinated with look and appearance, the destruction, I would say, of Germany after the war. And during his time there, he would acquire many objects from local sources. Flea markets are somehow turned up, and he brought them into his studio and began making assemblages out of them. So the work is based on a bathtub, but it's a bathtub that is very similar in appearance to a lot of people's first glance to a coffin. So there's this ambiguity which is enhanced by the accumulation of dirt and ash inside the tub. So it does have this feeling of a tomb. And over it he's placed a glass on which he's arranged a number of black and white photographs that kind of document the life of a German soldier taken from the point of view of his family. So it was like a family album of someone whose fate at this point is not known, it's anonymous. And at the same time you realize that this sense of loss and destruction that pervades the piece is something that Kienholz felt very acutely. And the fact that he then went on to have a deep lifetime relationship with Berlin, so that it became in many ways his second home, it makes the work that much more significant from our perspective, because it really shows his art turning in a particular direction from a sort of a neo-Dada attitude to something that's more historically grounded and specifically about historical consciousness. We are very fortunate to have a Doug Wheeler installation piece that we're showing for the very first time. It's the only remaining version of these large illuminated elements that he would place into rooms that had been prepared in such a way as to remove the sense of an edge around it. Beginning behind the viewer and moving up towards the sculpture itself is what's called coving, that turns the corners of the room into a curve, and the curve becomes more extreme as it approaches the element itself. So that as you're standing in front of the piece and looking straight on at it, you're subliminally aware that all of the edges, all of the sharp lines around you have been removed, and that everything is curved in this very organic sense. And I think Wheeler is one of the sort of fundamental light and space artists, right up there with Irwin and Turrell. Ocma's Untitled Robert Irwin work is one of the stars of the show, and he had been a painter for many years and had tried to achieve optical effects through the paintings, and only gradually was he starting to work with the technology of shaped acrylic, where he could create surfaces that were curved and that had varying degrees of transparency and translucency, and then finally in some cases opacity. What happens is the piece achieves a kind of a total edgelessness. You look at it and you can't quite identify where the piece ends and the wall begins. And because he was such an important artist in this community, somehow the museum was lucky enough to get the work, along with other Irwins that we have, and really be able to show people, you know, this moment in the studio that ends up having a direct impact on art history. And it's something that happened nearby. Art Dwayne Valentine comes from a series of works that the artist made at a time when a lot of artists in Los Angeles were beginning to experiment with new materials, in particular fiberglass and acrylic. Dwayne Valentine had been trained as really a traditional sculptor. He knew welding, but what he wanted to create was a shape and a form that had a very sculptural presence in the world that seemed to reflect a visual importance, both by the way it was shaped, by its color, and by its really beautiful surface. The only way an artist could have done this prior to the time that Valentine was working in this mode would have been through a very expensive casting process. Before Valentine, no one was really making sculptures of that size and presenting it as art. And so the piece belongs to this moment when the discovery of all this potential in these new materials that were being used first by the aerospace industry and then by the car industry and then in surfing. So we're standing in front of Kim Dinkel's Press Room installation from the mid-90s, and this is a work of art that really caught the art world by surprise at the moment that it was made. The stuffed animals strewn around the floor remind me a little bit of Mike Kelly, who was emerging at that time and beginning to use this cheap, sentimental detritus from American culture in a way that really was cutting edge, that really was disturbing in many ways. And what Kim Dinkel has done is amped that up significantly by including a self-portraiture, but not as she is today or not as an adult. Instead, she's a toddler, and they are the kind of id unleashed. They're angry, they're destructive, and they're very, very impulsive. And by making this a self-portrait, I think what the artist is doing is touching on this idea that we indulge ourselves as adults today in a way that kind of makes us want to harken back to those angry, those terrible twos phase of a child's behavior, and saying, you know what, we learn to be violent adults when we're 2 years old. That's the transition, and I think the work really pinpoints that moment in artists' psyche's development. I probably am most gratified by the people who pick up on the fact that we're trying to emphasize that Orange County, where we're located, has always had its own avant-garde, that there have been things going on in Fullerton, in Santa Ana, in Laguna, in Newport Beach, that really were quite strange and difficult to apprehend and challenging at the time that they were made. And so what we've been able to do, and I think people are responding to it, is take the big names that you know about, the more famous household names from both coasts, and mix them together with something that was happening right in our own community. And so when people respond that way, that's when I'm the happiest, because I didn't want to make this seem like it was one line or one point of view, but rather several different point of views kind of all coming together in one space.